We're starting our women's studies class with a small look at the history of women's movements, a pretty small look at the history of women's movements. But the place that it started was the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton creating the Declaration of Sentiments, which was patterned after the Declaration of Independence. And that list of resolutions, right? They call them resolutions, demands they made of society are really, really fascinating to look at. They're hard to read. They're tricky, I think, but they're tricky, like to make out the language of them. For some reason, the writing seems so just hard to make sense of in these days. They seem like they're way smarter than we are ever nowadays. But to think about that first women's movement, that it culminated in the suffrage movement, that women achieved the right to vote again. Not all women. So many times when we talk about women's history, we talk about it as if it were all women. No, a lot of times there's a lot of racial division. And when we talk about achievements, we mean that white women get the opportunity, not necessarily all women, individuals of color. And so that's really, really important to take a look at. One thing I do want to share with you again from that time is this piece in front of you as I'm talking. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a freed slave who gave a powerful speech that you see before you about her lived experience and how society defines her. And she continuously asked the question, and ain't I a woman? And so again, just another look at so many women in history that we don't necessarily learn about in our traditional history books and things along those lines. That is, we talk about, and what we're going to do another assignment about this week with the Declaration of Sentiments. That's a little look at the first women's movement. When we talk about the second women's movement after World War II, actually now getting into the 60s and 70s, we're again making those kind of larger societal assumptions when we say, oh, and in the second women's movement, women left the homes and went out into the workforce. Not necessarily all women, right? So again, we are talking about two different identifiers. White middle-class women, women of any racial background, no matter their no matter their racial background, rather, their socioeconomic status had a great impact. If you do not have middle-class resources and are from a working-class background, working for everybody, regardless of gender, is crucial. Nowadays, in our modern day society, quite honestly, to achieve a middle class resources, and quite honestly, arguably, maybe not even those, it takes multiple people in a family, whether it's a heteronormative male-female relationship or female-female relationship. Like it takes like every person of gender identity out in the workforce to be able to amass the resources needed for a middle-class lifestyle or just even the basics of our society. And so something to kind of keep in mind when we talk about these, like, again, larger, like all women got the right to vote. Women went from the home into the workplace. We're not necessarily saying all women, and that's one of those nuances that we really need to make sure we always keep in the forefront. But in the second movement time of the 60s and 70s, that's when women's studies began as a major, a topic, a class in college. And so women's studies is actually really kind of cool because it's interdisciplinary, which means it's pulling from history, it's pulling from sociology, it's pulling from psychology, it's pulling from literature. So there's all these different aspects that come together to be women's studies as opposed to something that is more like just purely one topic. We've got all different kinds of areas of study. And a lot of times what's really neat is if you meet faculty in women and gender studies, they certainly have a background in women's studies. Some of their degrees or aspects of their degrees are in women's studies. Like, for instance, I was a double major in my undergrad in sociology and women and gender studies. Then I went on to get my master's in sociology. But a lot of times I have colleagues that have some of their degrees are in English, some of their degrees are in cultural studies, and they're combining them with their background in women's studies, kind of really, really broadening our experience in the things that we do and talk about in these classes. So the very first class was in 1969 at Cornell, was the very first women's studies class. And then the next year, San Diego State launched the first program. I have never been to San Diego State, but I dream of like the fact, I think that there should be like a little museum there that we could go visit. There probably isn't. Probably the door to the Women and Gender Studies department probably doesn't even like, I don't know, does it even say over the door like this was the first one? But I like to think that it does. So that just seems like it should to me, and it would be very fun to get to go to see like a women's studies museum. I would totally go on a road trip to see that. So granted, it'd be just a small little 2-hour road trip, but still, here nor there. So when there was the 50th anniversary celebration in 2009, which is now more than a dozen years ago, they took a look at how many women's studies programs there were, and it went from, just that one to over 900. And there were 31 master's programs and 13 PhD programs in women and gender studies at the time. And then at that point, 10,000 courses of teaching 90,000 plus students. So now, these years later, we've got to be well over hundreds of thousands of students, I would imagine, hopefully, as it has kind of grown and as society's understanding of the importance of understanding gender has grown. So has this area. So women's studies has an association like most things do, right? And so I wanted to finish this off by taking a look at kind of their mission statement, that women's studies is the educational strategy of a breakthrough in consciousness and knowledge. The uniqueness of women's studies has been and remains its refusal to accept sterile divisions between the academy and community, between the growth of the mind and the health of the body, between intellect and passion, and between the individual and society. I think there's a lot of beauty in this. We're saying that it's important to nurture your mind, but also to nurture your body. We're saying when they say the academy, between the divisions between the academy and community, the academy, what they mean, they're referring to like higher education and college. And a lot of times people in higher education and college they call it kind of the ivory tower, like it's separate from the real world, like it's this exclusive place. And yeah, we a lot of times can make institutions like that exclusive. But what women's studies is trying to say is no, we don't want that division. We want the collegiate experience, the college experience to be like a community, and we want to value community learning in all that we do. Intellect and passion. When was the last time that you took a class or had something that you did in school that you felt incredibly passionate about? It's really, I won't get all emotional and cry, but I usually do because I just love this stuff a heck of a lot. But it means a heck of a lot to see students come alive and to see them just see this experience and what they're learning happen all around them, and to quickly realize how they already have a profound understanding of the world around them, and that understanding is valued in women's studies. Your thoughts, your analysis, your lived experience, your background is valued in women's studies. I like to think of women's studies, it's a home. There's an energy to it that's not in other areas of college, I believe. Women's studies came out of an activist mentality that was activism within education. All of education up until that point had been a Eurocentric, right, masculine kind of focus. And women's studies wanted to disrupt that and wanted different areas of knowledge and wanted different theorists and wanted more voices and wanted to value voices. So that's why I'm so excited every time a student walks in to a women's studies class. I know there's a lot of times misconceptions, about what it is. But what it is in my mind and what it is, as you can see before you, is an opportunity to love learning, to see the heart and the soul of learning. And I really, really hope going through this course, you get to experience that too.